You're listening to an Airwave Media Podcast.
Sick of those trivia podcasts that you don't even understand how to operate and they just have too many levers and buttons?
There's got to be a better way.
Now there is, with Good Job Brain, an offbeat quiz show and trivia podcast that makes learning new things easy and fun.
I just learned that artificial vanilla flavoring sometimes comes from the anal glands of a beaver, and now I can never shake that mental image. Thanks, Good Job Brain.
Good Job Brain is available for the low price of just 4 easy payments of free. It's a podcast.
Good Job Brain is part of Airwave Media and available on all podcast apps. Operators are standing by.
Hold your ears, folks. It's showtime.
People pay good money to see this movie. When they go out to a theater, they want cold sodas, hot popcorn, and no monsters in the projection booth.
Everyone pretend podcasting isn't boring.
Turn it off.
Turn it off.
Welcome to the projection booth. I'm your host, Mike White. Joining me once again is Ms. Kat Ellinger.
Hello.
Also back in the booth is Mr. Jonathan Owen.
Hello.
Czech-Timber continues with a look at Oil Lamps, the 1971 film from Juraj Herz. It's based on a novel by Jaroslav Havlicek, in which our protagonist, Stepa Kilianova, who's played by Iva Janzurová, she is the vivacious 30-year-old daughter of a wealthy couple who agrees to marry her cousin Paul, who has accumulated very large debts as an Austrian army officer. Paul refuses to work or consummate the marriage as his health steadily declines. Why? Because he has syphilis. First time I watched this movie, I had no idea that he had syphilis until maybe 3/4 of the way through the film when somebody very outright says, "Oh, he has syphilis." Makes it a lot easier to understand when you know that going in.
The French disease.
The love disease, I think they call it at one point too. Jonathan, when was the first time you saw the film and what did you think?
Well, I think I first saw it about 10 years ago, 2011, and it was probably the fourth film of Hertz's that I had seen. I did like it the first time I saw it, but I think for a long time it was always a little bit under the shadow of The Cremator and Morgiana. And I think the most sort of powerful thing for me on the first viewing was Petr Cepak's performance and the sort of degeneration that his character goes through, and especially that laugh that he has, that kind of giggling laugh. I think as I've watched it more, I've come to love it more. I've come to appreciate it more because I think it's maybe one of Hertz's subtler films. It's one of his more low-key films, at least in comparison with something like Morgiana. So yeah, I think definitely it's one that's grown on me the more I've seen it.
And how about you, Kat?
Yeah, I saw it several years ago. Obviously, I've been on here before talking about my love for Juraj Herz. I just love everything that I've seen that he's done, which is most of his work. I haven't seen everything, but I've seen most of it. Unfortunately, some of it is difficult to get hold of, and some of his early films I've seen without subs, and I don't speak Czech, so, that's not very helpful. I really love this one. My favourite Herz film, though, of all of them is Sweet Games of Last Summer. And I see this as like a bit of a continuation of that. It's just a lot darker. But I'm a sucker for costumes. And Herz really just nails it with the whole fin de siècle look. There's like scenes in this film actually that, especially skipping ahead here, but when she's in the barn, that remind me of John Rolland's Fascination, just with what she's wearing and standing in this barn. And so I just absolutely love it. But I'm like, if I love something, that's it. I just love it. So I'm probably not the best person to ask when it comes to like critical opinion. Cause I'm just like, oh, look at the hats. Look at the dancing people. Oh, they've got like a little woman with a beard dancing, and that's like basically my level that I interact with film. But I love Herz. I absolutely love him.
I think that's a really great connection, though, I think, to reference the fin de siècle, because I think this is the most fin de siècle film that you could have, isn't it? Literally beginning at the new year, 1899 to 1900. And the way it's set up, I think, with that credit sequence where you have that kind of Art Nouveau style imagery. Yeah, I think that's true too about the connection with Sweet Games of Last Summer. And it shares at least one of the cast members, doesn't it, with that one? And it's interesting because I think that he described The Cremator as his expressionist film, and then Sweet Games of Last Summer as his impressionist film. And I think you could say that this is his secessionist film in that, secession is the sort of Czech term for Art Nouveau. So this is very much, I think, his Art Nouveau film.
Yeah, and I love that about Herz. I just love, one, that he's always really experimental. Every single film has a different sort of signature to it. And two, that he always brings in, like, you can see he's drawing from art and from literature as opposed to a purely cinematic thing, which I think is true of a lot of the Czech New Wave, because there wasn't that access to cinema that people in the French New Wave had. They were drawing from art, literature, philosophy. And you see it a lot in, or even in people like Zhuravsky, Borowczak, people that come out of Poland, people that like this almost like painterly approach to film. And Herz could go really over the top with that. He wasn't afraid to experiment, which I just love. He would just throw everything at it. And so his films, a lot of the time, are like really visually opulent, which of course is like my thing. But this is like a more of a toned down version of Morgiana visually as well. It's like, it's a nice sort of middle point between that and Sweet Games. So he's not just randomly thrown. I think you can see a continuation through his films. He's not just throwing things in for the sake of it, but there's definitely experimentation.
What's remarkable is that there is that continuity from The Cremator, especially to this one, and then on to Morgiana. And yet, like, when you think of what has happened between making The Cremator and then making this film, is it within that sort of couple of years, there's this whole sort of transformation of the film industry. So basically you have the Soviet invasion, and then you have this crackdown, which takes place sort of 69, 70, and the sort of film industry is re-centralized. And basically Herz, I think, felt that he was in a very difficult position at this point, and he had a few projects that he was wanting to make. I mean, there was an adaptation of Alfred Jarry's novel, The Super Male, that he was wanting to do, and then a couple of adaptations of other Ladislav Fuchs novels. And I think that was really the path that he was going to go down. And so he felt like at this point, basically, that his whole career was derailed. And I think this was basically a kind of like a compensatory project, as was Morgiana. And yet when you actually look at it from the outside, I mean, it doesn't seem like that. It does seem that there is this great continuity, I think, from the style of the Cremator through this and then on to Morgiana. So it's interesting that, despite his own experience where he felt that he was doing projects that were kind of like second best choices, I mean, it does seem that they are very much in a similar vein, really. And I think he was one of the few filmmakers actually who was able to kind of maintain that continuity into the 70s.
Yeah, because he was going to do Fuchs of Mice and Mooshaber.
Yeah.
Which is a fucking bonkers novel.
It's crazy.
I would love to have seen what he'd done with that, which has had an English translation, by the way, for anyone listening. You can actually get that, and it's worth reading, but it's so surreal. I think with this one, it's not outright. So a lot of people know him from his more horror type films. But he did do drama as well. But this one does have aspects of gothic grotesque in it as well. And it also has that kind of continuation in a focus on madness and violence, which obviously you can see across his career. He seemed particularly drawn to madness. And then he do the same thing again with Morgiana. So you see that continuation of themes, even though he was he was really, really compromised by the Czech system, but he made some really interesting work in the 70s regardless of that. So all power to him. I mean, Beauty and the Beast, incredible, The Ninth Heart. So he was still able to do a little bit within this family-friendly romance drama or fairy tale thing. But he just put a really weird and grotesque spin on it.
It's somehow in that tradition, I guess, of like the Hollywood studio system, isn't it? And the original idea of auteurism, where basically, you take on these projects which are in a genre that is kind of like an established, popular genre at the time. But what you do is you steal in your own idiosyncrasies, your own visual style, and you kind of make it your own. And I think that's really what he did. I mean, Beauty and the Beast is a great example of that, isn't it? Of taking a genre that was very popular at the time, where you see a lot of other Czech fairy tales, but he makes one that, I mean, it's basically like a horror film under the guise of a fairy tale. And I think another consistency too is that kind of psychological reality, isn't it? I think he's interested in that kind of interior view of events, and it's the gulf between, reality and our perceptions of it. And I think, you could say, well, both of the main characters in Oil Lamps, I mean, have this, particular kind of introspective point of view, which he kind of really delves into. I think whether it's, Stepa and her kind of dreams of, of romance and of marriage, or it's, Pavel and then his kind of mental degeneration. I think that's very much part of his aesthetic or part of his theme, isn't it, really?
For anyone who's enjoyed the Cremator, it definitely has some similar threads. All that talk about class as well, and social standing, greed, jealousy. It's just not as horrific, although Paul's laugh is quite horrific. It's quite disturbing as he gets more prominent.
He is so good in this, and she's wonderful as well. And it took me a few times to really kind of grasp onto this story, especially some of the more subtle things, like at the beginning when she's trying to get people to dance with her, men to dance with her, and they're like, no, you'll step on my feet. And it's just like, oh, so she's kind of a loser, I guess, just a little bit. And, I said before, she's 30 and not married, which was kind of like a death sentence at this time. So she's really desperate to get a man in her life, so desperate that she does go to Pavel. And he is very dastardly, this whole conversation. Is it his brother and his father that he's constantly talking with?
God, the brother is a beast. I'm calling him Paul because my subs have him as Paul, but it is Pavel. But the brother is an absolute, just utter beast. He's revolting.
I find him worse somehow. Yeah, he's a more unpleasant character because I think he never does anything nice. And there's not even at least with Pavel, you have that kind of, sort of glamour of being this kind of like, Austrian soldier, and you have that sort of dashing quality. But yeah, Pavel, there's really nothing nice or pleasant about him at all, is there really?
He's just beastly and like really like Neanderthal. And I feel really sorry for that maid, Polly, who just seems to attract the sadistic attentions of both brothers. And you only ever see her when she's sort of shrieking and running away from one or the other, or just looking really freaked out. But that whole farm setup that they've got is just really weird. The father is like some sort of cuckold guy in the background who has no authority. Who got it's just a really weird setup in their farm.
It reminded me of Faster Pussycat Kill with the weird father and his two sons.
It is. And then Stefa's family are like really into sort of social mobility and you just think, how are these related? Like, how the fuck are these people related? Because they're like the total opposite. Her family.
I think it's the wife, isn't it? I think Stepa's mother is the sister of the father of Jan and Pavel, isn't it? But yeah, like you say, it's kind of like just different kind of, but equally kind of unpleasant situations, aren't they really? I think going back to that idea of the Gothic and the way the Gothic, I think is a sort of subtle presence here. I think that, the Velrikovsko or the Vejrikovsko farm, it is a kind of like a Gothic location, isn't it? Because there is this sort of whole backstory. There's this sort of historical legend around it about the original founder of the estate who is meant to have married like a demon or a devil. And this is this whole sort of like, ghost story kind of history, which I think it kind of establishes it really as this sort of damned or this sort of cursed environment, I think.
Oh, it totally is a Gothic film, but just in a very, very subtle way that people might not outwardly recognize as Gothic. But all the stuff about madness they talk a lot about, if he'd had a child and inheriting madness and inheriting syphilis, and that just seems very Gothic to me as well. Although he's not so horrible. He doesn't, I'm jumping ahead again, but Pavel at least doesn't impregnate her. He spares her that.
Well, he can't, can he? I think he's impotent from the syphilis.
Is he,
I think so.
I like the bit, well, again, jumping ahead, where he just brings in that stand-in. That stand-in guy.
That's just horrible, isn't it? Yeah.
Without telling her. It's just kind of like...
Stunt cock! Stunt cock! Stunt cock!
Well, you wanted a kid, but he doesn't think to discuss it with her first. He just sends his rapey, drunk friend round to service her. It's just, the whole thing, when you look into it, is as fucked up as the family in the cremator. Which, again, you've got the patriarch in that is a total lunatic.
And like you say, it's like, the way that Manka, the servant girl is treated is almost like a sort of like a horrible sort of exaggerated version of the way Stepa is treated. And it's just this idea that kind of like women are just like passed around, isn't it? And, it's like how, Manka initially she's raped by Pavel and then she's attacked later by Jan.
Yeah, that's what I mean. He does rape us. So how does that function? If he's supposed to be completely impotent, that's the bit I don't understand. Not to go too much into the technical things here.
It may be like a later point. I think by the point they marry, I wonder maybe he's just sort of degenerated further from that point. But yeah, it's not really made clear, I think.
Yeah, because that seems to happen. And then the next minute he's pursuing Stepa. So... But like you said, that could have just been an amount of time has passed and he just hasn't shown that. But that confused me because that then brings about further sort of conflict between those two brothers who are at loggerheads. But Stepa, the reason I love her is I love her at the beginning. She is just like this really, that's why she reminds me of, the Sweet Games of Last Summer, which is very much about feminine sexuality and freedom and things like this, more in a more romantic, delicate way, I'd say. But when you meet her at the beginning, she's so free-spirited and she's surrounded by these fucking men, especially that Grow man the tax collector who's her parents or her mother actually wants her to marry, like accusing her of being unladylike for drinking beer. He sacks her off for having a brazen, shameless hat. And he's like, gets her to this really serious talk, are you going to give up the hat? And it's like, for fuck's sake, like she is constantly surrounded by these blokes. Apart from her father, who seems kind of open-minded and romantic himself.
You're right about the Gothic stuff. I was so reminded at times while I was watching this of things like Rebecca or Wuthering Heights. Yeah, it just felt like there was always storm clouds on the horizon, and she was just our always suffering female protagonist.
That is so much a Gothic romance, I think, which does, weirdly, I was talking about this in a completely unrelated essay recently, how strangely Gothic fiction largely derived from that sort of model. But when it comes to film, you rarely see it in classic horror film. It's tended to register more in the melodrama that Hollywood were doing. You didn't really see it so much in horror, apart from things like maybe The Innocent. But this idea of you get this young, very innocent, naive maiden who marries some cad or some guy with an awful secret. Like they've always got some fucking awful secret or some family curse. And it becomes like Bluebeard. As soon as she gets it, and the house is always in the middle of nowhere, like something like Jane Eyre and Rochester with his wife locked up in the attic. They're out in the middle of nowhere. They fall for some guy thinking he's something he isn't. And it really is Gothic in that way. And then the thing I love about that, though, is quite often then within that mode, the innocent girl becomes very resilient and resourceful. And it's usually her, although a lot of them she's ultimately saved by a man, but then they were written in the 1800s. So, what do you expect? But she becomes more resourceful and she matures. And you definitely see that in Stepa's character, although it has like a very cynical sort of end to it. It doesn't have that happy end to it.
Well, this movie is so cynical. I love the beginning. You're talking about how it's changing to the 20th century. And then there's the one guy who's just like, in 100 years, there's not going to be war. There's not going to be this. And just like talking about how great it's going to be in 100 years. And yeah, it was 1971 when this came out. So we still had a little bit of time, but still I feel it's very much like Herz going, yeah, look at how deluded we were. We had 2 world wars coming up. We had Russian occupation, all this stuff. So let's just put these words into this guy's mouth and make him look a little bit like a fool, because it is super cynical.
I wrote down one of the lines that he says where, in that introductory sequence, he says, art will give the poet all the license that he needs. In 100 years, there will be no oppressed classes or nations. And then you're putting this in a film in 1971, sort of 3 years after the Soviet Union has invaded Czechoslovakia and sort of, brought about this huge crackdown on free speech, on art. And so, it's a very charged sentiment, I think, at this point.
The man who's going to come and rescue you is diseased with syphilis.
And also the way he kind of lies to her, because he says, you'll have freedom. That's how he ultimately woos her. And she doesn't, because she is just really oppressed. As soon as she gets into bed with him, that's it. Her life as before is over. There's no more theatre. One of the more touching scenes for me is when she bumps into her old friend from the theatre near the end, and she's like, oh, it's a new crowd. And, it's just, she's become completely cut off from that. But there are these themes in it of like alienation, isolation, oppression. And you can just tell that Herz was obviously working out some frustrations in that film.
It's interesting because you have that kind of group of like younger people, don't you, who are kind of more free-spirited. It's like the 2 actors that you see, and then you see more of them in that sequence where they're kind of setting off that hot air balloon. And it's as though there is this sort of promise that there is this more free-spirited, more liberatory kind of lifestyle that she's kind of not quite, part of. I guess she's friendly with those people, but still she's a slightly different, maybe different age group. And, there is this promise maybe of something different. But yeah, as you say, by the end, she sees one of the actors again, and then he's got this black suit on. And I think he talks about, the fact that he and his former acting partner, that they're kind of like in business, they have families, and it's as though that promise has disappeared really by the end.
I want to talk a little bit about the title too, just oil lamps, because there is one very pointed scene at the beginning where there are a lot of lamps being lit, and there's one lamp that gets lit and there's a couple in the background that are making out. Another time we have a man in the foreground and he's lighting a lamp, and as soon as he lights it, a woman's face appears and they start to snog, and it's just like, okay, what is it with the oil lamps? Is it that this is
the bed scene as well? When their marriage night, when he turns away from her and they're in the bed side by side but miles apart, there's a massive great lamp in between them in the foreground.
I think it's got that sort of visual symbolism, hasn't it, in that it represents, on the one hand, I guess, the sort of the promise of the wedding night, because I guess as the light is dimmed, that is when the sort of the wedding night begins. But as you say, visually, it's used to sort of divide them, isn't it, in the shot? So it's kind of like becomes the thing that actually symbolizes the fact that they're not going to have this wedding night. And it's like really the end of her romantic dreams, I think.
We're making this sound so depressing, but it really isn't.
There are moments where it's pretty depressing.
Yeah, but where else can you see a fight in a barnyard with a man in a smoking jacket, full on wrestling in the mud?
I watched this quite a few months ago, and then when I came back to it and was rewatching it for this, I kept mixing it up with Morgiana in my head, because there was the scene in Morgiana where I think it's the one guy that the quote-unquote good sister wants to be with, and he's in town, and I want to say he wears an outfit very similar to what Pavel wears in this. And so I was just like, oh, where's that scene where they have to like rush and get him, and he's in this bar, and nope, that's not in here. But it was just like, oh, it's so similar to Morgiana in some of the stylistic choices. I mean, makes sense, same director.
There's a lot of walking on cliff edges as well, which is something that's used very differently in Morgiana.
Oh, yeah.
One thing that's worth noting is that one of the things that had to be cut from the finished film, that there was a scene, I think during the second sequence, one of the later sequences at the cliffs, where Stepa basically takes Pavel away, and in the original film there is like a longer or like a sort of a later development of that scene where basically I think she takes him on her back and she sort of like pulls him away from the cliffs. And apparently the censors cut that out because there was something about the way that she was carrying him that seemed too sexually suggestive, which I mean makes no sense, but yeah, apparently they read it that way and he had to cut it out. But that scene, when you look at that scene, it does seem a little abrupt, doesn't it? That,
Yeah, I wondered what happened there.
I thought it was cut because in the next scene you then see someone dead. So I thought maybe it was just to try and put tension in there, is it Pavel? But it does end like totally, you think he's going to go into some sort of monologue and then it just cuts and you're in another scene then. That makes a lot of sense now.
There was another scene too, but I think that didn't even get to filming. And I think his initial idea for the big opening scene was that it would have this kind of like foggy, this kind of like misty, beautiful morning, and it would be set like at this brothel, and basically you would see Pavel with a group of soldiers and they would be kind of like leaving or riding away from the brothel, and you would have like the prostitutes waving at him, and that would be kind of like basically a suggestion of how he has contracted syphilis. But again, yeah, this was just not acceptable. So I kind of like the beginning that it has, though. I'm not sure if that would have maybe been better than what we see, because I do like that sort of theatrical opening that it has with the curtains, and you have this sort of theatrical scene, which is really like a very kind of deliberate way of foreshadowing the marriage, isn't it? So I think I like the beginning that it has, really.
I do, but I hate it when they cut the brothels, which seems to
brothels
be a
again. Yeah,
theme on this podcast.
Last time it was adding brothel scene. This time it's removing. He should have sold it to Italy. I think he would have been able to put it back, I think.
You know what this movie needs? It's a really good brothel scene. I've got just the thing for you.
Yeah, it's interesting in relation to the representation of Stepa, because I think as she was represented in the novel, she was a somewhat different figure. And I think that the fact that she is like an outsider, or that she's a kind of like a misfit, was as much about her appearance. And I think Herz really just wanted Iva Janzurová to play the part. And I don't think he cared really that she didn't look like the character as she appears in the book. So I think in the book is very detailed. It's like incredibly kind of rich with, physical detail, and it really goes into detail about how unattractive she is and how she just looks wrong, basically. And she's kind of like physically cumbersome. And I kind of like the fact that I think given the casting choice, and I think the way Herz represents her, is that it seems like the way she is in the film it's more of a comment on the fact that she's basically, a liberated, free-spirited figure who defies, I think, sort of traditional female or feminine sort of codes of behavior. And it makes it more of a comment, I think, on women's status. And I think that was quite a progressive change that he made, really. And I kind of like the way she is in the film, I think, compared with how she is in the book.
Well, that's one of the things I really love about her character, and the fact that she sort of unwittingly humiliates men, like when she's doing the Skittles, and then it just keeps knocking all the pins down in front of Groman. You can't even get one, which seems like to be this is one of Hertz's films that has the least subtle humour, but that does seem like a direct comment on maybe his prowess or his
She's just amazing, and we've talked about her so many times before. I mean, it is hard to imagine that this is the same woman that was in Coach to Vienna as well as Morgiana. I mean, she's just very much a chameleon depending on how she's dressed, how she's made up, and she's just terrific.
She does kind of remind me, though, of the good sister. So she plays a dual role in Morgiana. The good sister in Morgiana is like a bit flighty and a bit naive. She is kind of like that, but just very exaggerated. She's like quite childlike in when you first meet her, and obviously she doesn't end up childlike. It kind of reminded me, though, of Borowczyk's Story of Sin, just without the sex and the brothels, because obviously that has both. But this idea of a woman committing to a man who, is fucked up by war and, has psychological problems and uses her. And yeah, it has a similar vibe. I don't know, visually it's a bit more avant-garde, whereas Story of Sin is Borowczyk's most sort of realistic film, if you could call it that. It's not quite. But Herz just seems to love to go over the top with things like costumes and that. Camera work's really interesting in this as well, because the dancing scenes, I don't know if they're done on a handheld, but there's a few scenes at the beginning where you're in the dancing scenes.
Oh, yeah. You almost feel drunk.
Yeah, spinning around, and there's a lot of close-ups and swaying in and swaying out.
Well, it is interesting what you're saying as far as him being a damaged man from war. I mean, I guess we could read the syphilis as more of like a PTSD type of thing and going untreated, and just that he just keeps cracking up a little bit more. I mean, that's one way to read the film, I suppose.
I mean, that relates to the shooting, doesn't it? He does a lot of shooting, and I guess you could read that as partly reflecting the fact, he's no longer a soldier and just doesn't really have anything to do. I guess you could also take it as like display sexuality, isn't it? Because he can't do anything else. And, there is that sort of phallic symbolism, isn't there, of the shotgun, which is very direct in one scene.
Yeah, the war theme is interesting because there's a couple of what look like throwaway comments. There's Stepa's father makes that comment that they won't take responsibility for what happened to him for getting him to sign up to the cadets. So you get this idea that he was once quite idealistic and probably more innocent, but being at war and contracting syphilis and whatever else happened to him, now he's just kind of cast aside with this limp, this obvious limp. People laugh at him. He's been humiliated. There's all that in there, even though he is horrible. I agree with Jonathan. The brother is much nastier, because Pavel just seems to be, I mean, he's feckless and but he's also very mentally ill. So you can sort of understand that it's not totally him, and he might have been a better person if he hadn't been to war. Now he's like nobody, or just a figure of fun. He can't have a child. He's had to marry his cousin to get money for the farm. He obviously cares what his father thinks about him. But even from that first scene when we meet him and she's sort of calling him a hero and, that must be really exciting. And he just cuts her off. He's just like really, you just think, who is that? He's just really rude to her, because it's like he doesn't want to accept that. He doesn't want to sort of play along.
Well, one of the reasons why he wants to marry her is because of the money situation. And that also speaks to a little bit about like him coming home, being disenfranchised, not being taken care of by the state who he fought for. And here he is broke and carrying all this debt. It's like you would hope that he would be taken care of by the state a little bit.
And he's kind of a pitiable figure, I think, ultimately, isn't he? And I almost feel there's a kind of parallel with Stepa in that they are both outsiders, aren't they, in one way or another? And there are certain sort of habits or things that kind of connect them. I mean, like the laugh, because, of course, she has that laugh, which I guess distinguishes her as something of an outsider at the beginning, that she's a little too loud for this society, for the sort of feminine decorum that she's meant to, respect. And he, of course, also develops the laugh as his condition worsens. So I feel that there is somehow some kind of weird affinity between them.
Oh, absolutely. Because her laugh is taken as humiliating by Groman. Is it Groman?
Yeah.
The tax collector. Like, he really doesn't like it. And he really, but with her, it's not, it's more because she's just being herself, and that's too much for everyone. Whereas Pavel, he can't really be himself at all. He's kind of stuck in this role. She falls in love with him thinking he's this big hero soldier, and even in that he's not, and he can't even be a farmer. Like he's basically useless in every way.
She almost falls in love more with the uniform than with the man inside of it.
Yeah, because it's a fairy tale to her in a way. She thinks it's a fairy tale.
Yeah, fairy tale's a really good analogy, I think, isn't it? Because it is about this woman that's trapped into this marriage. And I mean, she is in this trap. And it's interesting that, if you think that Herz later directed a version of Beauty and the Beast, because this is almost like a reverse, isn't it? So where the beast gradually reveals its humanity, Pavel becomes less and less himself. Like you say, he becomes, he degenerates, he becomes less and less human. So it's almost like an inversion of that story.
And I love a good fairy tale.
And I have been rewatching it as we've been talking and seeing, you talked about the handheld camera, and I'm seeing several shots of handheld stuff, especially, you're talking about the dance, of course, there's a lot of that, but even just like when they come to visit the farm the first time, there's a handheld shot of them coming through the gate, and it's like, okay, so they've got quite a bit of handheld footage in this.
Well, that was the thing with Herz, is he would experiment with cinematography, and obviously with the cremator, they had a special lens made for the camera. And then later with Morgiana, he would use the fisheye, which he said he later regretted using it so much. But it was just like, fucking hell, we got this fisheye. Let's just get some more on it, which personally I love because it kind of breaks conventions. I do love the Hollywood melodramas, absolutely love them, but they're so formal in the way that they're shot. And there's often this convention with period stuff that it should be shot in this very understated, you shouldn't see any of the camera, and it's just almost theatrical. Whereas the sort of period ones that Herz does, and he did work in period settings a few times. So Sweet Games was one of them, Morgiana, this one. He uses things like very modern things for 1970, like a handheld camera, like a fisheye, like really strange angles, like in Morgiana, a lot of the time you're in the cat's point of view, so you're basically on the floor. He did it in the cremator, extreme close-ups, and I just really love that aspect of his work. It's really playful. I don't think he was deliberately trying to break convention. He was just very experimental. I think he saw film more in again, going back to what we were saying about how he drew from art and literature more as a like painterly sort of artistic medium, if that makes sense. Which, again, you see in a lot of those Eastern European directors. They use it as almost like they're using it as a canvas. And you saw a lot of it in the Czech New Wave, but Herz was always different. He was always like a bit of an outsider with his experimentations and the way that he would do things.
And I think he continued that into the 70s, which was so rare, really. Like a lot of the Czech films of this period, because of the sort of inhibitions that were placed on filmmakers, I mean, are kind of visually flat. They're not very kind of formalist in that term that was often used in a negative way at the time. And, Herz, I think, really is able to defy that. And, I mean, his films are, including like the two fairy tale films, they're still visually very rich, aren't they? Those also use a lot of handheld camera, a lot of moving camera, a lot of point of view shots. I particularly love in this the use of point of view shots during the promenading sequences. You have like two big sequences where Pavel and Stepa walk out together, and then you have her point of view of the faces. And of course, that's a way to emphasize the fact that, the first time and the second time, the expressions are completely different.
Oh, it's wonderful. And it is, like I think Mike said, it's dizzying as well, because you're thrown into especially that opener, you'll just throw, and then there's another dance outside as well, where you feel like you're being ricocheted around this parade of faces. And it's just such a Herz thing to do. I love a lot of the Czech fairy tales and the stuff. A lot of it was, made for TV and stuff. But like Jonathan said, technically it's very flat, very sort of, whereas Herz always had to exaggerate everything. Like costumes exaggerate, like her fucking hats could be a film in and of themselves, because that one hat she's got at the beginning, there's a whole story in that fucking hat. It's huge. And he just really has to ramp it up on everything. And he continued to do that in the 70s, where you saw a much more pragmatic kind of, approach to making fairy tale films, which I still love them. But I think when me and Mike and Sam talked about The Little Mermaid, which has wonderful avant-garde costuming, but the cinematography in that is actually very flat. There's not a lot of camera movement in it. And I think that was something we discussed when we talked about that film, The Czech Little Mermaid. The director just used costumes to make it look a bit more. But if you look at the camera's barely moving. Where in this one, you're being thrown around here, there and everywhere. When the maid is being chased around, that's another standout scene for me. By the brother chased around that courtyard or whatever it is and you are, following him, and then she's being shoved to the floor. It's the sort of thing you see in a bloody slasher, not a fairy tale film. There's just so much energy in that scene.
And I think as well as like the fluidity of the camera work, there's also that fluidity of the kind of movement from one scene to the next, which I guess is something that he did in a very overt and innovative way in The Cremator, where you have that literal kind of like, conflation of the last scene with the next scene. But I feel here too, there is a sense in which the film, it just kind of flows, doesn't it, from one scene into the next. You're not really aware of like the time shifting. I guess the only kind of markers of that are like the way the seasons change, or I guess the way her costumes change. But there is this sort of like head on kind of, development, isn't there, where, you're kind of just being taken on this. It's as though it's like this inexorable path kind of into doom, isn't it? And, there are no kind of markers of time. And I think that's another thing about his movies, that there's that kind of just fluid development.
Well, they just seem to exist in their own little universes, don't they? Even in something like The Cremator, which is supposed to be Nazi-occupied Czechoslovakia, it exists in this really strange little bubble. Its own time, its own place. Like in Cremator, 1 minute it's Christmas and then it's not. You just don't know, what the timeline is. And he does that so much, I think, which is another thing I love about his films. There is that very fluid, like Jonathan said, like a very fluid approach to things. I just noticed the cinematographer, who I'm not aware of his work really, Dodo Simonkic. He was also the cinematographer on Sweet Games, which is interesting.
He also worked with Jacobisko. I think he directed. I think he photographed.
My other favourite.
Yeah, I think Deserter and the Nomads. I think the second, the one with the craziest camera work. So yeah, I guess that makes sense, I think.
I noticed too that the screenwriter that's credited with Herz is his first credit, which was his only credit before Oil Lamps, was also working with Jacobisko, working on is it Years of Christ is how you normally see it translated, Christoph Rocky.
Yeah, that's Lubor Doutnal. And actually, I believe what you see like in the credits is it says Václav Šášek, Lubor Doutnal, Juraj Herz. And I think the story was, according to Herz, that Šášek wrote the first draft of the script and basically brought it to Herz. Herz said, basically, I like the story, I like the idea of making this film, but, you can't write, basically. So I'm going to have to get somebody else to rewrite the story, rewrite the script. And so basically got Doutnal in. And I think Doutnal and Herz basically sat down and just rewrote the whole thing from the novel. So yeah, I think basically that is Doutnal and Hertz's work, really. And that's Hertz's version of it. I mean, Šášek might have a different account, but that's the story given in Hertz's memoir. So
Jacobisko was Slovak as well, wasn't he? As was Herz. And he was had this weird sort of magical realism, I know Jonathan's an expert in Slovak things. Is that something Slovakian, maybe?
That's definitely true, I think, in Jacobisko's case, because I think his influence was like naive painting and the kind of Slovak folk culture, the culture of like Eastern Slovakia, which I believe he was actually encouraged to kind of emphasize when he was at FAMU. So I think on Jacobisko's side, I think there is definitely that, sort of cultural dimension to that. Of course, there was a surrealist movement in Slovakia too, as there was like on the, in the Czech lands. In Slovakia, this tended to take a more sort of mythical form. It tended to be based more in sort of folk traditions, fairy tales. So I guess that would apply to Herz as well. Herz, I think, he's somewhat of an unusual figure in that he is Slovak, but tended to work more like on the Czech side of the industry. So I feel he's less attached somehow to the sort of Slovak background than was Jacobisko.
He did feel like an outsider though, didn't he, to the whole FAMU lot, and studied puppetry and took a different route into film, and then worked with Brinich who was his mentor. I think the interviews that I have found with him, there seems to be like a bit of they didn't accept me at FAMU. I was always a bit of an outsider. And his work is funny because the cremator kind of gets put in the Czech New Wave, but like now. But at the time, he always felt like an outsider to that and was just basically doing his own thing. That's why his work stands out. It is different. It's like much less concerned with political things as well, and much more concerned with things like the Gothic and fantasy and these sort of eternal themes like madness, greed. Obviously, certain politics would creep in, but it wasn't as overtly political as some of the FAMU stuff.
I mean, he was much more interested, I think, in genre cinema, right from the beginning. Like, I mean, his first film, his first feature film, Sign of Cancer, I mean, is basically like a murder mystery. His second film was a kind of like comedy musical, I guess. And, so I think right from the beginning, there is that interest in genre, which I think actually served him well through the 70s, because I guess he could make films within a genre, as in, the fairy tale films, but use that as a vehicle, for his own sort of visual style, his own themes. And I think that was maybe one reason why he was able to adapt better than I think a lot of the new wave directors were. Yeah, I think, like you say, there was always that sense of exclusion, I think, based on the fact that he had not been at FAMU. And there's that story about, I think it was Jaroslav Kuchera, the cinematographer, saying, that I think this was on Pearls of the Deep, which was Hertz's first film, saying, I'm not going to work with you because, you didn't study at FAMU. Like, who are you, basically?
And then he comes back and does more Guyana.
Yeah.
Once he proved himself. You did feel, though, that he was, I think he was much more genre. He's the closest Czech cinema gets to a horror director. And I think that was something he was kind of proud of in a way.
Well, especially later with like Ferret Vampire.
Which is, again, they weren't making horror film in Eastern Europe.
That's one of the things I love, actually, that, in these times of like elevated horror and of people saying, well, it's not a horror film. He was so proud to say that, I am a horror director. I love horror. I believe there's even an interview where he said, his favorite film that he had made was The Cremator. When he was asked why, he said, because it's a horror film. And yeah, I think there was always that embrace of horror. And I think that kind of wish that he could have made more horror films, really. And, I think that one of the sad things about his career is that he was never able to go quite as far as he wanted to do, because, Ferret Vampire, I think in the initial script, it was a lot gorier. I think The Ninth Heart too. And there were things that he had to cut from both of those. So I think had he had more freedom, he would have gone even further, I think, in that kind of gothic and, sort of horror direction.
You mentioned the lyricism of the film, and I completely agree. And I think a lot of that, too, has to do with the music, and just another brilliant score by, is it Lubos Fischer? Fantastic. As soon as you start watching it, the second time, it's like, oh, yeah, I remember this theme. They play it quite a few times, but it just fits the film so well.
Well, music is such an important part of Hertz's films. You get references to music all the time come up in them as well. He's obviously really loved music. But the musical aspects of this, because as Jonathan said, he did make a musical. Is it The Limping Devil? Which is a very strange film, and I've only ever seen subtitled, so I didn't have a bloody clue what was going on. But that is a musical. And when I remember when I first saw this one, thinking, oh, this looks like it's going to kind of be a musical, but then it settles down after about 20 minutes. But you do get in the first 20 minutes just all these big musical numbers, like that are framed like they would be in a traditional music, like a conventional musical, big ensemble, everyone singing and dancing, very choreographed. And then it kind of, that stops as Stepa walks out of that world. But I really love that aspect of the film.
The promenade sequences too have that military, that parade music, don't they? And it's as though this is kind of like a dance, or it's like this kind of musical number set to this music where everybody is like performing and parading themselves. So I think it's also like a comment on the society, isn't it? That this is a society where everybody is, on display, to be looked at and to be approved by each other.
Yeah, because there's a huge cast in this one compared to some of his other films. Lots of crowd scenes with lots of people and very, very busy in parts. And then you've got that house, which is basically empty. So it makes like a nice counterpoint to that. Can I just say though, every time I see this film, I want her to adopt that bloody kid.
Yeah.
I am.
It's so heartbreaking, isn't it?
Oh yeah.
And that nun with the moustache, and it's just like, just give her the kid. And then you get that bit at the end. And even though I know what's going to happen, it gets me every time. It's like, just go and speak to the nun. And then she just walks in and shuts the door. And it's just like, no, you could have had the little kid who looks like someone from Annie.
Another reason why Jan is such a bastard as well, isn't it? That he just won't accept the child at the end.
Yeah, and he's just flippantly, you see that little kid and you think, oh, maybe they've sorted something out and she's going to adopt this kid. And then he flippantly sort of says, oh, I said we wouldn't accept his bastard. And that's, yeah. And you're just like, oh. And then they're kind of discussing him taking Pavel's place with Stepa, which is just really insidious. And you just think she would be out of the frying pan into the bloody fire in that situation.
And again, I think something that's different, I believe, from the novel, where I think the end of the novel has, I think, a similar development, but I think it's portrayed, as I remember, in a slightly more positive way, where it's about the fact, well, now she can, get to work as a farmer, she can find meaning in being, in farming and in this sort of rural lifestyle. Whereas, in the film, you just get that final shot, don't you, of the gates closing, and it's just total entrapment.
Yeah, it's really, I think of all of Hertz's films, it's one of the most cynical endings. They generally don't have happy endings, but it's very cynical. Like, quite often, you get a big thing happens and then, there's like a bit of a cynicism at the end, or not a happy ending. But this one with the walking into the gates is like she's damned, is just, it's like that at the end.
And it's a beautiful parallel too, isn't it? Because the opening of the film is the curtains opening, isn't it? And, it's the optimism, the hope of the new century. Then the final shot is the gates closing, isn't it? And it's just, doom, damnation.
Turn away, go after the little girl.
And you only see the girl through, you see her through glass, don't you, in the train, and then you see her through the glass in the window, and then the final time she's at a big distance, isn't she, from Stepa? So you never see her kind of like in this sort of direct or kind of like unmediated way. So I think that's very nice visual detail.
Is Stepa, is she an actress? Because there's so many interesting photographs of her, and there's one part where they're out in front of a marquee, and it looked like pictures of her.
Yeah, I think it's alluded to, isn't it, that was how she was in her past. And she certainly knows that whole theatre crowd as well.
Yeah, there's more of that in the book, because basically the film is like the second and third part of the book. And then the first part is really more the kind of like backstory around the farm, and then about her childhood and her youth. And so there's a lot more about how she's into sort of amateur dramatics, basically. So I think it's sort of like dropped into the film in a sort of much more sort of subtle way. It's not really as evident, but I think she's part of this kind of like acting crowd, and apparently is a very good actress. She's probably better than I think the other people, and it's like initially something that gives her a certain kind of distinction. So again, it's another reason why it's so horrible that as the film continues, she's not really able to pursue that.
Did you read this in English?
I read it in Czech, and I got about halfway. I was hoping to finish it actually for the episode, but it's quite long and it's incredibly detailed. So like my vocabulary was really put to the test. A lot of the vocabulary is slightly archaic too. So, I must admit it did somewhat defeat me. And, I think it does deserve a translation though. And, I would compare it maybe with somebody like Thomas Hardy. Maybe it's that kind of, that kind of literature.
No, I get that. I love Thomas Hardy, though.
Yeah, I think he's seen as the master of like psychological realism. I think that's the sort of the term that's usually attached to Havlicek. But what I was surprised by was that the novel was actually written in the 1930s, and then it was revised later in the 40s. So it was actually a lot later than the setting. And it does read like a novel of the period in which it's set. So interesting that he too, just like Herz, is kind of like looking back on an earlier period.
Yeah, I was kind of reminded a little bit of like Ragtime, just with the way that we have the turn of the century and everybody looking forward to things, and then everything goes to shit.
Yeah, it's like a cynical 20th century perspective, I think, isn't it, looking back?
Yeah, I can't even imagine in 1930 and 1940 when, the world had already undergone one war and they were headed directly or embroiled in a second war, how naive people must have thought that the 20th century was going to be such a different time.
I think if anybody is a fan of oil lamps and wants more sort of like gothic, depressing Czech cinema, I think they should watch a film called, it has two titles in English. One is The Curse of the House of Hein, and the other title is Uncle Cyril. And this is a film from the late 80s directed by Juraj Svoboda, but is also adapted from a novel by Jaroslav Havlicek. This is about this kind of gothic family. It's about this ambitious young man who marries into this basically very strange family, and in the family, you have this terrible secret, which is this kind of mad uncle who believes that he is invisible, and he is played by Petr Cepak. So there's a direct connection. And I think there's a couple
I've never seen this. It's
really good. It's much more, I guess, overtly gothic and overtly lurid than this film, but I think there's definitely a parallel. And again, similar themes about, madness, I think the curse of family, the curse of environment, heredity, childbirth. Yeah. So definitely one to check out. The only thing it doesn't have, I think, compared with this film is it doesn't have as great a score. So, but in other respects, I think this is a worthy counterpart really to Oil Lamps.
Cepak has such a great look to him. I love when he shows up in things, and he is another actor who can just look so different. Like, there he is in Morgiana, and he's got those massive mutton chop sideburns, and it's just like, is that the same? Oh yeah, I guess that is the same guy. And I'll see him in things like I Killed Einstein, Gentlemen. It's like, is that the? Oh yeah, that is. He's one of those very familiar faces, but he's not nearly, to me, as recognizable as other people, because he can just put himself into a role and you're just like, who is this actor? And then you look him up and you're like, oh, I've seen this guy 100 times before.
Oh, he's one of those faces, isn't he? I love that about Czech cinema, is you get so many, and they were all like really solid theatrical actors as well. And they just turn up time and time again because there was a strong industry there despite the limitations. So there was a lot of opportunity for work, but after you start watching a few, you get your favorite faces, and then you're just like, yeah.
It's very fluid too, isn't it? And it seems that, actors would be happy to just do a major role in one film and then would just pop up as like a face in one scene in another film. And there is that kind of sense of, the same people kind of like recurring, but like at different levels. And, sometimes you'll just see somebody pop up at one moment. And even on the soundtrack, which is something I found out recently, you have actually Josef Sommer, who plays Hubitschka in Closely Observed Trains. Apparently in this film he's dubbing the voice of Jan. So there's one of those other great performers there, just as a voice.
I was looking up because this played at Cannes in 1972, and there's a list of films that also played that same year. And it's just such an amazing time to see things like The Ruling Class, The Seduction of Mimi. I mean, it's just like Images by Altman, Jeremiah Johnson, Das und Hill by Fleischman. There's just like so many films where I'm like, oh my God, what a year. Solaris played the same year. It's like, my goodness.
There's a great story about that, actually, which Herz tells in his memoir. I hope this is not too anecdotal, but there's basically this story that, Herz went to Cannes with the film. They actually allowed him to go, to present the film at Cannes in competition. And apparently he could only go on the condition that he was accompanied by a Barrandov official. So this official that he went with basically, I think, was like an ex-prison officer. And so basically the whole time that Herz was there at Cannes, he just kept him like under lock and key. Like Herz couldn't go to a party. He couldn't go to any event without this guy coming with him. And then the story is that Herz knew that Solaris was playing and he really wanted to see Solaris. And this guy said, oh, I've heard that, in France they make porno movies and they show porno movies. So I want to go to this porn theater. And so basically he took Herz to this porn cinema, and Herz is saying, well, I'm sitting in this porn cinema with this Barrandov official and I could have been watching Solaris instead.
Right. Oh God.
That biography really needs an English translation.
It sure does.
It's amazing. Yeah, the stories. And the name too is great. Autopsy. Brilliant title, I think.
All right, let's go ahead and take a break, and we're going to play a preview for next week's episode.
Sick of those trivia podcasts that you don't even understand how to operate and they just have too many levers and buttons?
There's got to be a better way.
Now there is, with Good Job Brain, an offbeat quiz show and trivia podcast that makes learning new things easy and fun.
I just learned that artificial vanilla flavoring sometimes comes from the anal glands of a beaver, and now I can never shake that mental image. Thanks, Good Job Brain.
Good Job Brain is available for the low price of just 4 easy payments of free. It's a podcast.
Good Job Brain is part of Airwave Media and available on all podcast apps. Operators are standing by.
Chci se vsadit, že se neřídí podle svého nosu. Neboť tento út je vždy poněkud uchýlen, buď vpravo nebo opět vlevo.
Cítím živě, že žvaníte, mistře. Zdáli se vám snad kozelce nedokonalými?
Hledáte-li dokonalost v kozelcích, nemám, co bych řekl.
That's right, we'll be back next week with a look at Capricious Summer. Until then, I want to thank my co-hosts, Jonathan and Kat. So, Kat, what is up with you?
I've just done a video essay on Mill the Stone Women for Arrow, which they've restored that film. At last, a decent restoration of it. And I also got let into the grown-up films. I got to do The Seventh Seal for BFI as a folk horror. So I'm quite sure some people are going to consider my commentary an act of sacrilege, but I have no regrets because I still maintain Seventh Seal as a horror film. I think that one's coming out quite soon as well, in the first UHD release for BFI as well. It's just like, whoa. Also, the folk horror box set, which I know Mike is part of with a projection booth, my Witch Hammer video essay from the second run DVD has been ported over, and I did a new commentary for that set on an Italian folk, like one of the Italians didn't really do much in the way of folk horror, Il Demonio, Brunello Rondi film, talking of everything's about Fellini. He was one of Fellini's script writers, made this sort of very weird, very political folk horror film in the early 60s, which was also Sergio Luciano Martino's first production thing. So, like, it was a convergence of all my loves coming together, that track. So that's going to be on the folk horror set, which when's that out, Mike? I can't remember when that's out. That's quite soon, isn't it? It's all out soon. And check me out on Patreon, Kat Ellinger's Confessions of a Cine Slut.
And Jonathan, how about yourself?
I'm going to be doing some research on the film Morgan, A Suitable Case for Treatment, which is actually also related to gorillas, but this is David Warner meets a gorilla, and this is this crazy 60s film about madness and performance and politics. It's a little bit forgotten these days, so I want to really look at the kind of how this film connects, I think, kitchen sink drama with swinging London and with the kind of hippie culture. So it's a little bit of a break from Czech cinema. I've also just finished a chapter on Czech cult cinema, and I'm looking specifically at the crazy comedies. And this is for a collection which I believe will be called Decolonizing Cult Cinema, and hopefully will be released or published next year, although I'm not quite sure yet because of the, current publishing schedules being impacted. But, hopefully next year that will be coming out.
Well, thank you so much, folks, for being on the show. Thanks to everybody for listening. Thanks especially to our Patreon community. If you want to join the community, visit patreon.com/projectionbooth. Every donation we get helps the projection booth take over the world.